They called it the cruelest thing Earl Mercer ever did. Della Mercer stood in that lawyer's office with her two children pressed against her sides, watching her brother and sister laugh at a piece of paper that was supposed to be her inheritance. And all she could do was stare at the single rusted key sitting in the center of the table. A $9 farmhouse. A condemned, rotting structure in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee. A building nobody wanted, nobody could sell, and that everyone with any sense agreed should have been torn down a decade ago. But what nobody in that room could have predicted, what nobody who ever drove past 14 Briar Fork Road on those long, empty country roads could have imagined, was that inside the crumbling walls of that forgotten farmhouse, hidden from the world for over a century, was something so extraordinary that it would not only change Della's life, but leave an entire county speechless. Stay with me until the end, because the moment her brother and sister finally walked through that farmhouse door and saw what Della had uncovered, their faces said everything words never could. The law office of Oaks and Prout sat on the second floor of a narrow brick building on Murphy's Main Street. It smelled like old paper and furniture polish. The receptionist spoke in a careful whisper, as though the building itself was always in the middle of something serious. On the morning of March 14th, Della Mercer sat in a chair that felt too stiff and too formal for someone wearing a second-hand sweater and boots held together with electrical tape. She was 36 years old. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back with a rubber band she'd found at the bottom of her bag. To her left sat Lily, 9 years old, quietly drawing shapes on a notepad the receptionist had given her. To her right, Sam, 6 years old, leaning against his mother's arm with the particular exhausted stillness children get when they've been moving too much and sleeping too little. Della's father, Earl Mercer, had died 5 weeks earlier, 71 years old, a stroke in the early morning, gone before the ambulance arrived. He'd been a quiet, complicated man. A former tobacco farmer who spent his last 2 decades bouncing between small rural properties in Tennessee, buying things cheap, selling them cheaper. Never quite building the life he seemed to always be reaching for. Della had been the one who drove 4 hours every few months to check on him. She organized his medications after his first minor stroke, sat with him through 2 hospitalizations, and helped him understand the paperwork the doctors handed over. She didn't do it expecting anything in return. She did it because he was her father and because nobody else was doing it. Her siblings had their own lives. Dennis, 43, ran a landscaping company in Knoxville and had a talent for making his absence sound like sacrifice. Patris, 41, had married into a comfortable life in Jackson and communicated mainly through brief texts and birthday cards that arrived 3 days late. Neither of them had visited Earl in the last 2 years of his life. Della knew this not because anyone told her, but because every time she arrived at his house, the guest room was exactly as she'd left it from the visit before. Same folded towel on the bed. Same half-empty water bottle on the nightstand. Attorney Franklin Oaks was a compact man in his late 60s, silver glasses, measured energy. The careful composure of someone who had delivered difficult news many times and had learned to do it steadily, without apology. He read the will in order. Dennis received the savings account, $47,000, plus a 2019 Ford pickup and a collection of antique farm tools. Patris received the investment portfolio, modest but real, valued at roughly $62,000, along with Earl's personal property, furniture, books, watches, and the few pieces of jewelry their mother had left behind. Dennis exhaled with quiet satisfaction. Patris allowed herself a small smile and wrote something in a leather notebook she'd brought, already calculating. Neither of them looked at Della. Oaks paused. He removed his glasses, cleaned them once with the cloth from his breast pocket, replaced them. Then he looked at Della with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not quite pity, but something close to it. Something that already knew what was coming. To my daughter Della, I leave the property located at 14 Briar Fork Road, Pickett County, Tennessee. The farmhouse, all structures on the land, all contents therein, and the 3.4 acres on which it stands. Dennis laughed first. It started as something controlled, and then it wasn't controlled at all. Patris pressed her hand over her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking. Della sat very still. "What's the property?" she asked quietly. "Dad bought it at a tax auction about 8 years ago," Dennis said, wiping his eye. "Paid $9 for it. Literally $9 because nobody else wanted it. He always talked about fixing it up someday." He shook his head. "He never did. The county has been after him for years," Patris added, composing herself. "There was a fire. Partial damage to one side, caved-in roof sections, a structural violation notice." She looked at Della with something dressed up as sympathy. "It's basically a liability." Oak slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were property documents and a key. Old iron, dark with age, heavier than it looked. "There is one condition," Oak said. "The property cannot be sold for 18 months from the date of Earl Mercer's passing. After that, you're free to sell or dispose of it as you see fit." 18 months, Dennis muttered. "You'll be paying property taxes on a condemned building you can't unload." Patris leaned forward with an offer that had clearly been rehearsed. "When the 18 months are up, we'll take it off your hands. We can probably do 10, maybe 15,000, enough to cover whatever you've spent on it by then." $15,000. For a condemned farmhouse on 3.4 acres that her father had paid $9 for. The contempt in that offer was breathtaking. Della picked up the key. It was cold and solid, and it fit her hand in a way that felt strangely deliberate. "Why would he do this?" she asked, not to Dennis or Patris, but to Oakes, the only person in the room she trusted with the question. Oakes looked at her carefully. "He told me that each of his children was receiving exactly what they deserved and exactly what they needed. He said you in particular would understand what to do with it, even if you didn't know that yet. You were always the responsible one," Dennis said, standing and buttoning his jacket. He patted her shoulder once, in a way that managed to feel like a dismissal. "But responsible doesn't always mean rewarded." He and Patris left together, already talking logistics, the truck, the investment account, next steps. Oakes gathered his papers and handed Della a second document, a property survey, a county inspection notice, and a photograph. The photograph showed a 2-story farmhouse set back from a gravel road. White paint peeling in long strips, a porch leaning away from the front of the house at a troubling angle, one upstairs window boarded with plywood. A handwritten no trespassing sign stapled to a post at the edge of an overgrown yard. Della sat alone at the mahogany table, an envelope, a key, a photograph, and 2 children who had quietly fallen asleep in their chairs without anyone noticing. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She and the children had been living out of her 2009 Honda Civic for 6 weeks. Since the Cookville apartment she'd rented on a caregiver's salary became unaffordable the week after her last client passed away. She had $214 in her bank account, a car with a slow leak in the rear left tire, and now a condemned farmhouse in a county she'd never been to. Her brother thought it was a joke. Her sister thought it was an insult. But Della looked at that photograph and saw something neither of them had looked closely enough to notice. Through all the damage and decay, the peeling paint, the leaning porch, the boarded windows, the structure of that house was still standing. Whatever had been done to it, whatever years of neglect and fire and Tennessee winters had thrown at it, the walls were still there. And sometimes, Della thought, closing her fingers around the key, the walls are the whole point. She woke Lily and Sam gently. held them both for a moment in the cold parking lot outside Oaks and Prout. Then she buckled them into the back seat, typed 14 Briar Fork Road into her phone, and started the car. They had a farmhouse to see. The drive to Pickett County took just under 2 hours. Della drove with the focused quiet that had become her default state over the past 6 weeks, radio off, eyes on the road. Her mind running numbers and possibilities, the way it always did when she had no good options, and needed to find one anyway. Lily sat in the back reading a library book she'd checked out 3 towns ago and never returned. Sam had fallen back asleep, cheek pressed against the window, mouth slightly open. Outside, Knoxville's edges gave way to smaller towns, then smaller still, and eventually to the long, flat stretches of rural Tennessee. Fields, tree lines. The occasional farmhouse, set so far back from the road it looked like it was trying not to be seen. Della had grown up in a small town not far from here. She knew this kind of country. She knew how silence sat differently in places like this, heavier, more honest. She knew the smell of red clay after rain, and the particular quality of light on an open field in early spring. Driving into this landscape felt less like arriving somewhere new, and more like returning somewhere she'd left without meaning to. The GPS took her off the main highway, then off a county road, onto a gravel lane running between 2 overgrown fields. A rusted mailbox leaned at the edge of the property, the numbers 22 barely visible beneath a skin of brown corrosion. Della turned in slowly. Gravel crunched under the tires. She drove about 100 yards and then the farmhouse came into full view and she stopped the car completely. The photograph had not done it justice. Distance had softened things. In person, there was no softening. The farmhouse was 2 stories of weathered white sitting on a low stone foundation, and it looked like it had been slowly losing an argument with time for the better part of 30 years. The front porch had separated from the main structure on the left side, tilting toward the ground at an angle that suggested the next significant wind might finish the job. Every ground floor window was either boarded or broken, the frames dark with moisture damage. The fire Patris had mentioned had taken most of the right side of the second floor. The exterior wall was blackened and bowed outward, and a section of roof had collapsed inward, leaving a ragged open wound that exposed dark rafters to the sky. Weeds had taken the yard completely. A collapsed fence ran along the left side of the property, its posts rotted at the base, lying in the grass like something that had simply given up. Behind the house, the skeleton of a barn stood in gray timber. A county condemnation notice was stapled to a wooden stake near the drive, faded, but legible. Sam had woken during the slow drive-in. He pressed his face against the window and stared. "Is that our house?" Della looked at it for a long moment before answering. "It's going to be," she said. Lily looked up from her book. "It looks broken." "It is," Della said, "but broken things can be fixed." She said it with more certainty than she felt. "Because that was what you did when your children were watching you decide whether to be afraid." She got out of the car and walked the perimeter first, the way she'd learned to during her father's illness, all the way around before going in. Looking at the foundation, the roofline, the exterior walls. The stone foundation was old but solid, mortar crumbling in places, but the stones themselves, massive and unmoved. The front and left side walls, away from the fire damage, were structurally intact. Soft wood in places, but the framing beneath was holding. The porch was cosmetic damage, serious looking, but not structural. The right side was a different story, but the bones were there. Della stood at the back of the property and made herself see it not as it was, but as it could be. Wide windows, good proportions, a generous footprint. 3.4 acres with a creek she could hear, but not yet see running along the back edge of the land. She walked back to the car and got the key. The front door was padlocked with a chain rusted nearly through. She didn't even need the bolt cutters she'd stopped to buy on the way. She applied steady pressure. The chain snapped with a dry crack. She used the old iron key in the door lock. It resisted, grinding with rust, and then turned a deep mechanical click that echoed off the porch boards. Della pushed the door open. The smell came first. Damp wood, ash, old earth, and underneath it all, something she couldn't name yet. Something dry and faintly sweet like cedar or old paper. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. Lily and Sam appeared at her sides, one under each arm, looking in with her. The three of them stood together at the threshold of a condemned farmhouse in Pickett County, Tennessee. $200 in the bank. Nowhere else to go. Della took a breath. Then she stepped inside. The inside was darker than the outside had prepared her for. She moved through the entrance slowly, phone light cutting through the dimness, the children close behind. The entry hall was narrow, with low ceilings and walls covered in peeling floral wallpaper, yellow and green, bubbled and separating from the plaster in long curling strips. The floor was wide plank wood buried under debris, plaster dust, leaves blown through broken windows, the remains of furniture, a three-legged chair, a broken picture frame, its glass long gone. She tested each step before committing her weight. The boards flexed but held. The main living room stopped her. Even through the damage, it was larger than she'd expected. Ceilings ran higher than typical for a farmhouse of this age, close to 10 feet. And the fireplace on the far wall was brick from floor to ceiling, wide enough to stand in. Its mantel was still intact, buried under thick gray dust. 2 large windows flanked it, both boarded from the outside, but she could see how much light they would hold. She moved through to the kitchen. A cast-iron wood-burning stove still stood against the back wall, heavy, dark, entirely solid. She moved carefully to the right side of the house. The fire damage was concentrated here, partial collapse, sections of the second floor brought down with it. She stood at the entrance to that room, assessed it, and stepped back. This was a problem for later, for when she had more resources and more of a plan. The staircase along the left interior wall surprised her. The treads were wide and solid, cut from thick timber that had barely shifted in however many decades this house had been standing. She went up slowly. Of the 3 second-floor rooms, 2 showed smoke damage and partial roof collapse, but the left side bedroom was untouched by the fire. Small, square, with a single window looking out over the fields, floor dusty but level, walls intact, this would be their room, at least for now. That evening, she made 2 sleeping areas on the floor with blankets from the car, swept a section of kitchen floor clean with a branch pulled from the yard. And they ate crackers and peanut butter by the light of her phone. Sam fell asleep quickly, the way he always did, completely and without argument. Lily lay on her back in the dark, looking at the ceiling before she finally spoke. "Mom," quietly. "Are we going to be okay?" Della lay beside her. She looked at the ceiling too. "Yes," she said. "I promise you we are." The first week was about survival and assessment. Della drove into the nearest town, a small place called Canwell, 12 miles down the county road, and bought the cheapest cleaning supplies she could find. Broom, mop, garbage bags, a basic tool kit, a utility knife. She spent 2 days doing nothing but removing debris from the ground floor, bag after bag carried out and piled at the edge of the property. She found rhythm in the work the way she always had in physical labor, the kind of rhythm that quiets the thinking mind and lets the body take over. She set up a camp stove on the kitchen counter, located the water shutoff and the electrical panel, both disconnected, both needing professional attention. She patched broken ground floor windows with plastic sheeting and duct tape, propped the front porch supports with lumber from the barn. Not a fix, but enough to stop the lean from getting worse before she could address it properly. By the end of the first week, the ground floor was clear. She could walk through every room without stepping over something, and the house felt different when it was clean. It breathed differently. It had a quality she couldn't feel through all the mess, something solid and purposeful in the way each room connected to the next. It was during the second week that it started. Della was in the living room running her hand along the wall beside the fireplace, checking for soft spots that might indicate water damage or structural issues behind the plaster. She pressed her palm flat against the wall and felt it, not softness, not damage, something else entirely, a seam, straight, deliberate, running vertically from about knee height to above her head. Not a crack, not settling. A seam that had been plastered over and painted, intentionally concealed but unmistakably there. She pressed harder. The wall gave slightly. Not collapsing, but flexing in a way that solid plaster over solid framing simply should not flex. Della stepped back and looked at the wall with completely different eyes. She ran her flashlight along it slowly. And now that she was looking, she could see it, a rectangle, roughly 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall. Plastered and painted to match the surrounding wall so closely that you would never notice it unless you were looking for something wrong. Someone had put something behind that wall, and they had gone to considerable effort to make sure nobody would ever know it was there. Della stood in the quiet farmhouse with her flashlight on that rectangle of plaster. She felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, not desperation. Something closer to the feeling you get at the very beginning of something, when you don't yet know what it is, but every instinct you have is telling you to pay attention. She went to find a hammer. If you're still with me, I think you know this story is something different. If it's hitting for you, go ahead and subscribe. Tomorrow I have something set aside that I think you'll want to see. The hammer was old, its handle worn smooth from decades of use, its head solid and heavy. Della held it before the plastered rectangle for a long moment before she swung. The first strike punched through easily, sending a small cloud of white dust into the air. She swung again, widening the hole. Then she stopped and shone her flashlight into the gap. Behind the plaster was not insulation, not framing, not empty darkness. Behind the plaster was wood. Old wood dark with age, fitted together with careful precision. Planks running horizontally, smooth and close-joined. Clearly not structural. Clearly something built deliberately and then hidden. Della worked carefully now, removing plaster in sections rather than swinging hard, pulling chunks away with her hands and setting them down quietly, as though noise might disturb whatever was back there. It took 20 minutes to clear enough plaster to understand what she was looking at. A cabinet, built directly into the wall cavity, framed out and fitted with horizontal shelves running the full height and width of the rectangle she'd identified. The wood was dark walnut, old growth, dense and fine-grained in a way modern lumber simply isn't. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each shelf was level and smooth, fitted with wooden pegs rather than nails. The joinery tight and clean, even after what must have been decades sealed inside that wall. And on the shelves, wrapped carefully in cloth gone stiff and brown with age, objects. Della reached in and lifted the nearest one, unwrapped it slowly. A glass bottle, dark amber, hand-blown, with an irregular shape no machine had ever made. She set it down and reached for another, a ceramic pitcher, cream-colored with a blue-painted pattern around its middle. The kind of folk art pottery American craftsmen made in the early 1800s. Another cloth revealed a small wooden box with a brass latch. Inside, nested in deteriorated velvet, was a collection of coins. She lifted one to her flashlight. The date stamped into the metal read 1847. She sat back on her heels and looked at what was in front of her. She was not an antiques expert. She had no particular knowledge of collectibles or historical artifacts, but she understood enough to know that what she was looking at was not junk. These objects had been wrapped carefully and hidden deliberately. Someone had built a concealed cabinet inside a wall of this farmhouse and filled it with things they considered worth protecting. The question was when, and why, and what exactly was she holding? Lily appeared in the doorway while Della was still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by unwrapped objects. Her eyes went wide. "What is all that?" She came and crouched beside her mother, picking up the ceramic pitcher carefully with both hands. The way she handled things she already understood were fragile. "It was hidden," Della said, "behind the wall. Someone hid all of this inside the wall a very long time ago." Sam came in behind his sister, saw the hole in the plaster, and immediately wanted to help make it bigger. Della redirected him to holding the flashlight instead, which he accepted with great seriousness. They spent the rest of that afternoon documenting everything. Della photographed each object before and after unwrapping, using her phone and a propped flashlight to get clear images. The cabinet held 23 objects in total: glass bottles of various sizes, all hand-blown, 4 pieces of ceramic pottery, each hand-painted, the coin collection, which contained over 60 individual coins ranging in date from the 1820s to the 1880s, a small oil lamp with an intact glass chimney, 2 hand-carved wooden figures, folk art, one a horse, one a human, both showing exceptional detail. And at the very back of the lowest shelf, wrapped in 2 layers of cloth and then in a piece of old leather tied with a cord, a journal. The journal was small, bound in brown leather gone dark and stiff with age. Della untied the cord with careful fingers and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the style of someone who had learned penmanship formally in an earlier era. The ink had faded to pale brown, but was entirely legible. At the top of the first page, in careful letters, a name, Sela's Cot, and below it a date, April 1888. Della sat on the dusty floor of the farmhouse with her 2 children on either side of her, and read the first entry by the light of her phone. The voice that came off those pages was precise and careful, a man who chose his words deliberately and meant every one of them. Sela's Cot had been a craftsman, a furniture maker and woodworker who had built this farmhouse with his own hands in 1871 and lived in it for the rest of his life. He had never married. He had no children, and in the spring of 1888, sensing that his health was failing, he had made a decision about the objects he'd collected and made over a lifetime of skilled work. He had decided to hide them, not out of fear exactly, but out of what he called, in his own words, a desire to keep them from those who would sell them without understanding what they were. He believed the right person would find them eventually. He wrote that he had faith in the house to hold them until that person came. He listed every object he'd placed in the cabinet, described each one, recorded where several pieces had come from and what they'd cost him in time, material, and care. Della read slowly, turning pages with the tips of her fingers. When she finished the last entry, she sat quietly for a long moment. Then she looked at the objects arranged on the floor around her and understood something that made her breath catch. These weren't just old things. Sela's Cot had been a craftsman of serious skill, working in a period when American folk art and handmade objects were produced at a quality the modern world had largely stopped creating. The coins alone, based on the dates and what she could pull up on her phone in the weak signal out here, could be worth significant money. The pottery, the glass, the carved figures, the lamp. She needed an expert. But sitting there on the floor of a farmhouse, her father had bought for $9, reading the journal of a man who had died over a century ago and trusted his house to keep his life's work safe, Della felt something shift inside her chest. Her father had known. He had to have known. Earl Mercer had bought this property at a tax auction and never done anything with it. Never renovated it, never sold it, never mentioned it to her directly. But he had left it to her specifically, deliberately to her. Not to Dennis, who would have sold it without a second thought. Not to Patris, who would have hired someone to clear it out without looking at anything carefully. To her, the one who showed up, the one who paid attention. The one who could see what things were worth when nobody else was bothering to look. She closed the journal gently and held it in both hands. Outside the farmhouse windows, the Tennessee fields were going gold in the late afternoon light. Sam had fallen asleep against her arm. Lily was examining the hand-carved horse with quiet concentration, turning it slowly, tracing the lines of it with one finger. Della looked at her daughter and thought about Sila's cot sealing up that cabinet in 1888, writing in his journal that the right person would come. She thought about her father paying $9 for a condemned farmhouse and leaving it to the only one of his children who would have walked through the door instead of away from it. Sometimes the most important things in a person's life arrive disguised as nothing at all. The morning after finding the cabinet, Della drove into Canwell with the journal, 3 ceramic pieces wrapped in clean cloth, and the coin collection sealed in a Ziploc bag from her glove compartment. She'd searched online the night before and found an antiques dealer in town, Calhoun Antiques, a small shop on the main street that had been operating for over 30 years. According to its faded window lettering, the owner, a compact, precise woman in her late 60s named June Aldred, looked at what Della laid on her counter and went very still in the way that people with genuine expertise go still when they encounter something that commands their full attention. June examined each ceramic piece under a magnifying glass without speaking. She turned the coins over one by one, setting certain ones aside in a careful separate pile. She read 3 pages of Sila's Cott's journal with the focused expression of someone reading something that mattered. Then she set everything down and looked at Della directly. "Where did you get these?" Della told her. "The farmhouse on Briar Fork Road." June was quiet for a moment. "Earl Mercer's property." "Yes, he was my father. He left it to me." June sat down on the stool behind her counter. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured. "The ceramic pieces are Tennessee pottery, mid-1800s regional folk art from a tradition that produced very few surviving examples in this condition. The coins include several that are genuinely rare. The journal," she tapped the cover gently. "If it's authentic, and I believe it is, it's a primary historical document. Sila's Cott was a known figure in Pickett County craft history. There are 2 of his pieces in the State Museum in Knoxville." Della absorbed this steadily. "What are we talking about in terms of value?" June folded her hands on the counter. "I want a proper appraisal before I give you numbers. But speaking as someone who's been in this business for 31 years, don't sell anything until you know exactly what you have. What I can tell you right now is that you should treat these objects as serious assets." Della drove back to the farmhouse with June's card and the name of an appraiser in Knoxville who specialized in American folk art and historical artifacts. She called from the parking lot and made an appointment for the following week. For the first time in 6 weeks, she allowed herself to feel something cautiously close to hope. But hope without work was just wishing, and Della had never been a person who wished. She was a person who worked, so she worked. Every day from sunup until the light failed. The porch. She found 4 solid timber posts in the collapsed barn, dragged them to the front of the house one at a time, and used them to shore up the supports. Working from a carpentry video she watched 3 times on her phone before attempting it. 2 full days, shoulders aching in a way that felt permanent. But when she was done, the porch was level and solid and the lean was gone. She tackled the boarded windows next, pulling away the plywood from inside and out, clearing broken glass with gloves improvised from duct tape. The effect was immediate and transformative. Light poured into the ground floor rooms and changed their entire character. The living room, with its high ceiling and wide fireplace, became something entirely different when the morning sun found it. It became beautiful. The town of Canwell began to notice her. People saw the truck parked at the hardware store, an old pickup she'd found behind the barn, its engine seized, eventually coaxed back to life with new oil and a battery bought on credit. People saw lights on in the farmhouse on Briar Fork Road that had been dark for decades. A semi-retired carpenter named Roy Tanner, who had done work on half the houses in Canwell over 40 years, drove past one afternoon. Saw Della on the roof patching damaged shingles with material salvaged from the barn, and pulled into the drive. He stood at the base of the ladder and looked up at her. "You know what you're doing up there?" "Learning," she said without stopping. He watched her for another minute. Then he went to his truck, got his tool belt, came back and climbed the ladder. "Move over," he said. "I'll show you the right way." Roy came back 4 more times over the following 2 weeks. Always unannounced. Always bringing something useful, roofing nails, weatherproof sealant. Once a whole sheet of plywood he claimed was left over from another job. He never asked for payment and deflected every time Della tried to offer something in return. He had a daughter about her age, he said once, and left it at that. A retired school teacher named M. Ardrey, who lived 3 miles down the road, stopped by one evening with a casserole and 2 juice boxes for the children. She'd heard about the woman fixing up the old Greer farmhouse, which was what the locals had always called it, and she wanted to see for herself. She stayed 2 hours, sitting on the newly stabilized porch while Lily showed her the hand-carved horse, and Sam demonstrated his expertise with the camp stove. Before she left, she pressed Della's hand and said, "That house has been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." The Knoxville appraiser Dr. Arthur Pemb, a careful and methodical man who specialized in 19th-century American material culture, drove out to the farmhouse 3 weeks after Della's call to examine the full collection in context. He spent 4 hours going through every object, photographing each one, cross-referencing against his records, making notes in a leather-bound notebook with quiet intensity. Lily sat nearby doing homework. Sam had fallen asleep on the swept living room floor with the wooden horse tucked under his arm. When Dr. Pemb finished, he closed his notebook and looked at Della with the composed expression of a professional delivering significant news. "I want to be precise," he said, "because precision matters here." He described each category in turn. The ceramics were museum quality for pieces in this condition. The coin collection included 3 genuinely rare examples, and one he wanted a colleague to confirm. The carved figures were fine examples of Tennessee folk sculpture. The glass was period correct and exceptional. The journal was a primary historical document of real significance. He opened his notebook to a page of figures and turned it toward her. "This is my preliminary range. Final appraisal will take several weeks and involve additional specialists, but I want you to have a working number so you understand what you're dealing with." Della looked at the page. The low end of his estimate, $340,000. The high end, $480,000. She read those numbers twice. Then she looked up at Dr. Pemb. He nodded once. Outside the farmhouse windows, the Tennessee fields were green and wide, and entirely indifferent to the fact that everything had just changed. She called Franklin Oaks the following morning. He was, as always, steady. "The artifacts were discovered within the property after title transferred to you. They were not inventoried as part of the estate because nobody knew they existed. Under Tennessee property law, contents discovered within an inherited property after transfer of title belong to the title holder. Their claim has no merit." He paused. "That said, it doesn't mean they won't file something anyway. People file things for reasons other than winning, to create pressure, to generate legal costs. to wear down someone they believe has fewer resources. What would a defense cost? If they push it to discovery, potentially 50,000 or more. Depending on how far they take it, Della thanked him and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse that Sela's cot had built in 1871 and thought about the nature of what was happening. Her siblings had laughed at her inheritance. They had offered her $15,000 for land, and a structure now understood to contain potentially $500,000 in historical artifacts. They had walked away from the will reading without looking back, certain they had received everything of value and left her with nothing. And now that the nothing had revealed itself to be something extraordinary, they wanted a share, not because they had earned it. Not because they had worked for it, sacrificed for it, or spent a single night on a cold floor believing in it, but because it existed and they didn't have it. Dennis called first. Then Patris, her approach softer, more personal. She talked about their childhood, their father, the way families fracture over money. She used the word unfair 3 times in 5 minutes, each time in reference to herself. Della listened to all of it. Then she said, "Dad demonstrated the character he hoped we'd have by the choices he made in his will. I'm going to honor those choices." Patris's softness evaporated. "You're being selfish." "I'm being clear," Della said. "There's a difference." She hung up and went back to work. The formal legal letter arrived 9 days later. A Knoxville firm representing Dennis and Patris jointly, asserting a claim to the artifacts as undisclosed estate assets, requesting immediate cessation of any sale or transfer pending resolution. Della read it twice, photographed it, and sent it to Oakes. His response came within the hour expected. "I'll handle the response. Don't worry." She wasn't worried exactly. She was tired in the specific way people get tired when they've done everything right and still find themselves having to defend it. But she had faced harder things than a bad faith legal letter. She had faced a condemned building with 2 children and $200. She had faced 6 weeks in a car in winter. She had faced a wall that needed a hammer and the courage to swing it. Whatever Dennis and Patris sent her way, she would face that too. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in late October at the Pickett County Courthouse, a solid brick building on the main square of Canwell that smelled like floor wax and old wood, with the particular institutional quiet of places where serious things are decided. Della arrived early with Franklin Oakes, who had driven down from Murphy the evening before. His leather briefcase contained everything Earl Mercer had ever said, written, or communicated to him about the will, organized and documented with the thoroughness of a man who had anticipated exactly this moment. Dennis and Patris arrived together with 2 attorneys from a Knoxville firm, both younger than Della expected, both carrying the careful confidence of people who had been told their case was solid. Dennis wore a dark suit and looked straight ahead. Patris looked at Della once in the hallway with an expression that wanted to communicate regret, but mostly communicated anxiety. The judge assigned to the matter was the Honorable Ruth Deering, 60 years old. With a reputation in Pickett County for moving through cases efficiently and tolerating very little she considered a waste of the court's time. Oakes presented first. He submitted documentation of every meeting he had held with Earl Mercer during the drafting of the will, his own detailed notes from each session, and a signed affidavit Earl had executed 6 months before his death, specifically addressing the Briar Fork Road property. The affidavit stated clearly, in Earl's own words, that the property at 14 Briar Fork Road was being left to Della Mercer in its entirety, including all structures, all land, and all contents therein, known and unknown, and that this distribution reflected his considered, voluntary judgment made in full possession of his faculties. Judge Deering read the affidavit carefully, set it down, looked at the opposing attorneys over her reading glasses with an expression that did not require interpretation. The opposing counsel argued that known and unknown was vague language that could not be held to cover artifacts of significant undisclosed value. Oakes responded that known and unknown was in fact precise language, chosen deliberately to cover exactly this eventuality, and that the testator's intent could not have been stated more clearly without his having opened the wall himself and taken a photograph. Judge Deering made a sound that, in a less formal setting, would have been a short laugh. Then came the argument Della had been dreading. The opposing counsel suggested that her prolonged presence as caregiver in the final years of Earl Mercer's life represented an opportunity for undue influence, that the disproportionate nature of the bequest warranted scrutiny of the circumstances under which the will had been executed. It was the argument that turned a legal filing into something personal, the suggestion that Della had manipulated her father, that her care had been strategic rather than genuine, that the woman who had driven 4 hours every few months, organized medications, sat through hospitalizations, had done all of it to position herself for inheritance. Della sat beside Oakes and kept her face still. She had prepared herself for this. She had known it was coming. It still landed hard, not because it shook her certainty about what she had done and why, but because it reduced something real and human and difficult to a legal tactic. And that reduction was its own kind of cruelty. Oakes responded without raising his voice. He submitted affidavits from Earl Mercer's physician, his neighbor of 12 years, and staff at the rehabilitation facility where Earl had spent 6 weeks after his second stroke. Each document attested to Earl's mental clarity, his strong will, his explicit and repeatedly stated pride in Della's dedication, and the complete absence of any indication that his decisions were influenced by anything other than his own clear judgment. He also submitted records showing that Dennis and Patris had not visited their father once in the final 2 years of his life. He did not editorialize. He simply submitted the documents and let them speak. The courtroom went quiet in the way courtrooms do when the outcome is becoming clear to everyone present before it is officially stated. Dennis sat with his jaw tight. Patris had stopped taking notes 20 minutes earlier and was looking at the table in front of her. Judge Deering reviewed everything. Then she addressed the courtroom. The claim of undisclosed estate assets, not supported by the language of the will or the documented intent of the testator. The claim of undue influence, not supported by any evidence presented and directly contradicted by the substantial documentation provided by the defense. The motion was denied in its entirety. She said it in the measured, final tone of someone closing a door that would not be opened again. Then she moved to the next matter on her docket. Outside the courthouse, the October air was cold and bright. The maples along the main square had gone fully red. Dennis and Patris came out a minute after Della and Oakes. Their attorneys were already on their phones. Dennis looked at Della across the courthouse steps with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not calculation, not contempt, not the careful friendliness of someone working towards something. Just a man standing in the cold looking at his sister with nothing left to say that would make any difference. Patris spoke first. Her voice was quiet. "I'm sorry." For all of it. Della looked at her for a moment. She believed the apology was real, or as real as Patris could make it under the circumstances. "That matters," she said. "It just doesn't change anything." She turned and walked with Oakes to his car. They sat in the driveway of the farmhouse for a moment before she got out. "Your father would be proud," Oakes said. He had said the same thing at the end of the will reading. It meant more the second time. Della nodded, got out of the car, stood in the yard of 14 Briar Fork Road and looked at the farmhouse in the October light. The windows were clear. The porch was straight and solid. A thin line of smoke rose from the kitchen stove chimney into the cold blue sky. Inside, she could hear Sam laughing at something, and Lily's voice responding. The building was still condemned on paper. There was still so much work to do, but it was hers, completely, officially, finally. She went inside to her children. The artifact sale took place in stages over 3 months, handled through Dr. Pem's network of specialist dealers, auction houses, and private collectors who moved in the quiet, deliberate world of serious American historical objects. Della did not rush it. She did not accept the first offer made for anything. She had waited this long. The right buyers were worth finding. The ceramic collection sold first, to a private collector in Savannah, who had been looking for a complete set of regional Tennessee folk pottery for 11 years. The price landed at the high end of Dr. Pem's range. The coin collection was split between 2 buyers, a numismatic specialist in St. Louis and a private collector in Georgia, who wanted the 3 rarest pieces specifically. The carved wooden figures went to a folk art gallery in Bristol, building a permanent exhibition of Tennessee sculpture. The glass and oil lamp sold through a specialist auction house in Knoxville. The journal went last, and was the most deliberate transaction of all. Della had conversations with 4 institutions before accepting an offer from the Kentucky-Tennessee Heritage Museum, which wanted it as a permanent addition to their collection of regional craft. History documents and expressed interest in mounting a small exhibition around Silas Cott's life and work. She negotiated the sale to include a named display crediting Silas Cott and the farmhouse at 14 Briar Fork Road. The museum agreed without hesitation. When the final transaction cleared and Dr. Pem sent the accounting summary, the total came to $418,000. After his fee and the auction house commissions, Della received $371,000. She sat at the kitchen table where Silas Cott had once sat, and looked at the number on her phone screen for a long time. It was the largest number that had ever been associated with her name in any context that wasn't a debt. She did not cry. She sat very still and let it become real at the pace it needed to become real. The first thing she did with the money was not what anyone expected. She called the Pickett County Building Department and requested a meeting with the county inspector to begin the formal process of having the condemnation order on 14 Briar Fork Road reviewed and lifted. She wanted it done right. She wanted it done officially. And she wanted the building that Silas Cott had constructed in 1871 to be recognized by the county that had condemned it as the sound and valuable structure it actually was. She hired Roy Tanner to oversee the renovation, which he accepted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been hoping she would ask. She hired locally for everything she could, paying fair wages and taking the time to explain to each person what she was trying to preserve and why. The cast-iron stove was restored by a specialist Roy knew in Jackson. The wide plank floors were cleaned and refinished by hand, every board kept original. The fireplace was repointed, the chimney rebuilt from the roofline up. The fire-damaged right side required new framing and new exterior walls, but Roy was meticulous about matching materials and methods to the original construction wherever possible. The barn was rebuilt over 6 weeks in early spring, using timber milled from trees that had come down on the property in a winter storm. Timber Della had set aside specifically for the purpose. The new barn was structurally modern, but built to look as it had looked in Silas Cott's time. Board and batten siding, gambrel roof, wide doors opening to the south. The collapsed fence along the property line was replaced, with split rail sourced from a farm 2 counties over. The yard was cleared and planted with a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house. Herbs and vegetables in raised beds built from reclaimed lumber. In the same location Silas Cott had described in his journal, where his mother had kept her garden. Ardrey came to see the finished farmhouse on a Saturday in late April, the same day the county inspector signed off on lifting the condemnation order. She stood on the front porch, solid and level and painted white, and looked at the house and the yard and the barn and the fields beyond with the expression of someone watching something be restored to what it had always deserved to be. "This is what it looked like," she said quietly. "In the old photographs, this is exactly what it looked like." Della stood beside her and looked at it too. She had never seen those photographs. But somehow she had built it back to the same place. The open house that evening was not planned as a celebration exactly, more as a simple acknowledgement that something had been completed, and that the people who had helped create it deserved to see what they'd built. Roy came with his wife. June Aldred from Calhoun Antiques spent a long time in the living room, looking at the wall beside the fireplace, carefully repaired and repainted now, the hidden cabinet removed, but its outline still faintly visible if you knew where to look. Dr. Pym drove down from Knoxville and walked through every room with the quiet pleasure of someone whose expertise had been part of something that mattered. Franklin Oakes stood in the kitchen without speaking for a while and then said, "Your father was right about you," which was the only thing Della needed to hear. Lily and Sam ran through the house and the yard, and the barn with the freedom of children who understood, without being told, that something important had happened, that their lives had changed in a way that was permanent and real. Sam had claimed the left side bedroom months ago and decorated it with drawings of the farmhouse at various stages of renovation, taped to the wall in rough chronological order. Lily had asked if she could keep a photograph of Sela's cot that the museum had provided, a formal portrait from the 1880s, a lean and careful-looking man with a woodworker's hands. It hung now in a small frame on the living room wall near where the hidden cabinet had been, because Lily said he should be able to see what happened to his house. Della had agreed completely. That evening, after everyone had gone, Della stood on the rooftop deck she had built from reclaimed lumber at the back of the house. April dark, warm. Fields invisible around her, the creek audible at the back of the property, the farmhouse solid beneath her feet. She thought about the morning of the will reading, Dennis laughing, Patris shaking her head, the key cold and heavy in her palm. She thought about the 6 weeks in the car, the first night on the floor of a condemned building with 1 blanket and 2 sleeping children. She thought about the hammer in her hand, the wall that gave way, the objects wrapped in brown cloth on shelves that had waited in the dark for 130 years for exactly the right person to find them. Her phone buzzed, a message from Dennis. It said only, "I heard it's beautiful, I'm glad." Della read it once, set her phone face down on the railing. She would respond eventually. Maybe the apology was real enough to deserve acknowledgement at some point, but not tonight. Tonight belonged to the farmhouse, to the fields and the creek and the 2 children asleep inside, to the craftsman whose journal had told her the right person would come, and to the father who had known, with the quiet certainty of a man who understood his children completely, exactly who that person would be. Earl Mercer had paid $9 for a condemned farmhouse and left it to the daughter everyone else had pitied. What he had actually given her was everything, not the artifacts, not the money, not even the land. What he had given her was the chance to discover what she was made of, when everything else was stripped away and all she had left was herself, and a key that fit a lock nobody else had bothered to open. She had opened it, she had walked through, and what she had built on the other side of that door, the home, the life, the proof of her own capacity, was worth more than any number Dr. Pym had ever written in his notebook. Della Mercer looked out at the dark Tennessee fields, breathed in the cold spring air, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely and entirely at peace. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. I'll see you tomorrow.